messages is running in the context of the service. So it's running this local system. So if a message isn't handled correctly or not handled at all, it might actually result in code executing in the context of local system instead of the context of the user. So that was a big hole that existed prior to Vista. And it was really a hole that it was sort of a situation where it existed in the system, in the platform. Most of the Microsoft services weren't using that, but a lot of third-party services may have wandered into that trap without knowing about it. So the way we actually address that in Vista is all of the services basically run on a non-interactive Windows Station and desktop. So any attempt to throw UI from a service essentially hangs. It hangs from the perspective of the UI is raised, but it's raised on a non-visible Windows Station and desktop. And there's actually an administrative tool that allows people to troubleshoot these situations. So they can switch to that desktop and view the content, but by default will no longer be bringing up UI that can be attacked on the user's desktop. So that was a really great change to make for Vista. There were some other more subtle changes around security that we've made. So for example, when you opt into any of this framework here, one thing that we do is we will ACL your process object to the service SID. So instead of it being ACLed to local system, for example, or network service, it's now ACLed to your process SID. So that prevents other services from manipulating you from the same privilege level.
So that's meaning that other services couldn't impact the binary on disk for the service? What's actually being ACLed?
Yeah, so it's actually the process object. So what that will affect directly is calls to open process. So if I tried to open up you for VM write access, and then I try to inject code into your process, well, I won't be able to get the handle to your process, so that attempt will fail.
So you can't patch a service in memory?
Yeah, at the same identity level. Now, this won't prevent somebody running as a local system that has the debug privilege present and the take ownership privilege present from asserting those privileges, whacking the ACL on your process, and then doing the dirty work. But in that situation, the attacker will have to satisfy those requirements, and also they may trip various audit records along the way as well. So that's another more subtle change that's not really visible to the end user or normally functioning services.
Cool. Well, so let's jump in to the end user.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things we're advertising with Vista is that we're making it a lot safer for users to spend time on the internet.
Right.
And obviously, a lot of what you talked about is directly related to that point, right? You can't. It's gonna be hard to get malware on your system. But let's so basically what I'm trying to spit out here is let's talk about protected mode.
Protected mode, IE, yes.
But that's taking advantage, of course, of UAC, which we haven't really touched on yet.
Yeah, so when I think about that onion that I referred to earlier,
Yes.
I'll just kind of draw the onion. At least this is how I think about it. So you've got the kernel here.
Mm-hmm.
You've got system services. And then you've got maybe administrative programs. And these are programs that are running as administrator. You've elevated to administrator.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've got UAC, standard user. And then there's a final sort of layer here, which I'll just call low rights programs. So this is what we've got. This is the situation we've got in Vista. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and erase this, and I'll just show you what it looked like before Vista. So prior to Vista, we basically had the kernel, system services, admin, and I'm just gonna, maybe this slice here is like a millimeter thick, so this is basically things running a standard user.
Okay.
And I only mention that for completeness because the system did support running as non-admin prior to Vista, but it wasn't really very usable, so a lot of applications broke. It was just too hard to administer. I've just put it there for completeness, but the size of that footprint is tiny.
Okay.
So what we had pre-Vista was the kernel, system services, and admin. Well, and this, all the code was running in one of these three, just, you know, pick. Well, it turns out that these things are all roughly equivalent. Basically, if you're admin, you can install a service. If you're an admin, you can install a driver. If you're a service, you can install a driver into the kernel, etc. So by definition, being present in any of these rings here, you have full control over the whole system. If you happen to run malicious software accidentally, basically the system is now owned. So that was the situation pre-Vista. Vista, actually I left off a ring here. Let me just see.
And I wonder, it's kind of hard to read this on this camera, but that's cool. We're keeping it a little, you know, it's Vista, but it's hard to see. So it's, I like the irony there.
So system services admin, and then I'm going to say limited services or hardened services. So these are, you know, these are services using the framework I just spoke about a few minutes ago. So really, we've transitioned from this mode of kind of three operating privilege levels, if you will, to a situation where we have many more compartments where code is running at different privilege levels. So we've got the kernel, it's still very highly privileged, of course. System services, the ones running as local system with no privileges stripped and no service hardening framework applied, they're still very privileged. Code running as admin can still penetrate system services in the kernel potentially. And then we move into the three new layers here. And if you look at the percentage of code that was running with full privilege level pre-Vista versus Vista, there's been a very dramatic shift there. So we've moved over 50% of the services that were previously here into this bucket here, for example. If you look at the code that's running in the user context, pre-Vista, all of it was running here, essentially. In Vista, the vast majority of it's running here with, you know, IE running here in the protected mode. And then in certain elevation scenarios where you need to be an admin, you've got code running here. But if you look at a steady state system, there's generally very little code running as admin. There's a lot of, you know, system service code running limited here. And then most of the code running as the user is going to be in these two here. So if something goes wrong, the system is in a much better position to protect the user.
Great.
So that's really an onion view of what I was talking about.
It's a little bit hard to see. I'm sorry for the people out there. It's just this color of
it's my handwriting,
of
too,
ink
I'm sure.
on white is hard for this camera to pick up. But I
So
think
as you-
people get the idea.
And as you get further out the onion, there's just fewer and fewer privileges. So, for example,
Correct.
What are privileges that you lose going from standard user to low right? So when you go from here to here, what can this guy not do that this guy can?
Yeah, so actually if you go back to the discussion we had around right restricted services, that same philosophy applies between the standard user and the low rights user. So if you do an analysis, you'll find out that the web browser, when running in protected mode, it can only write to a very specific directory. And then some things are virtualized under the covers from an application compatibility perspective to write somewhere else.